Hello and welcome wherever you are to this special episode of the Ricardian Podcast, the podcast of the Richard III Society. This time, our guests and I are taking a close look at the highlights of the 2026 edition of the Society's academic journal, the Ricardian. This year's Ricardian is the 36th volume of the journal, which dates back at least, I think, until 1968, and it includes historical articles and book reviews, and I'm delighted to say that we're joined by its wonderful editor, who is no stranger to the podcast, Dr. Joanna Laynesmith, as well as two of its esteemed contributors. We've got Sandra Pendlington, a retired headmistress and now a historical researcher. Sandra also has a PhD in mathematics. And we have Dr. Eleanor Webb, a newly minted doctor who is a post-doctoral fellow at Cornell, who's calling in from the USA. Welcome, one and all. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Okay. Hello. Right then. Joanna Laynesmith, let's turn to you first. There are perhaps 150 to 200 academic journals dedicated to the study of history in the UK alone. So before we go into the edition, can you tell us, what does the Ricardian do that other historical journals don't?
Well, it is the only journal that is completely focused on the life and times of Richard III. So if your passion is for the Wars of the Roses, the late 15th century, or specifically Richard III, then you've got a better chance of finding several articles you're really fascinated by if you're looking at the Ricardian. It's also quite unusual in that it's a free gift with membership of the Richard III Society, so it's not just aimed at the academic community, it's also very much also aimed at the members of the society, and there's a really rich range of contributors. Some of them are in universities, a lot of them are not. So it is quite unique.
So does that mean that there's a more diverse range of contributors to this journal, as opposed to other journals that people will be familiar with, such as the English Historical Review or Today?
That is my perception. Yes, I think there probably is a wider range, not least because there are so many society members who are really keen on doing the research, and there's it's a research community which supports that.
And in terms of creating the journal, is the process the same as for, say, the EHR or all these other journals?
Well, certainly, like other journals, we send all the articles off to be read by experts in the field and then take on board their comments and so forth. I think because the editor has always been someone who is themselves an expert in the 15th century, we probably as editors take more close involvement in the process than sometimes happens.
Yeah, okay. And so the article which is submitted is probably read by one or two other historians as well as yourself? Would that be
Yes.
normal? Right. Okay. Brilliant. Okay. All right. Well, let's turn to this edition, the 36th volume. What can readers look forward to with when this one lands on digitally on their doormats? What are the highlights of the edition?
Well, I think I'm really pleased this time that we've got a great balance between articles that are completely focused on Richard and articles which look at his wider times. So the life and times of Richard III is perfectly balanced through here. Well, we've got 8 main articles and then a couple of little research notes as well. So the 4 that are looking at the life and times, there's one that's looking at the rewriting of a saint's life in a manuscript, which I think is really intriguing. It's about the life of St Hilda, and what seems to be happening is that the author is not at all worried about being true to previous stories of Hilda. You really see that this doesn't matter. He's much more interested in the meaning. But what fascinates me particularly about this is the way he's drawing in classical epic ideas in this reshaping of an early medieval saint, and that kind of overlaps with what people have been saying quite a bit about chronicles. We're more and more conscious of how early chroniclers were being influenced by classical literature in writing it. And I would say at that point that somebody who's particularly highlighted this is John Watts in his recent book on the Wars of the Roses, which is one of a number of really interesting book reviews. I think people sometimes overlook the book review element to the Ricardian, and there's some really fascinating ones that I hope people will read. And then the other general ones, we've got one looking at the mystery, really, of the identity of someone mentioned in the will of Lady Catherine Gordon, who was, as most listeners will be aware, married to the Yorkist pretender who caused so much trouble to Henry VII in the 1490s.
So the man known to history as Perkin Warbeck, just
That
for
one,
yes,
exactly, who
yep.
called himself Richard of England. And then, the ones focusing on Richard, I am including one which I'm particularly excited about, I suppose, is that it's one looking at ideas about him from disability studies, because the Shakespeare's Richard III has been a really key figure in studies for ever since disability history, disability studies has been around, really, because he's such an early example of the idea of a disabled person coming to terms with or how they respond to their situation. But now, of course, we know exactly that Richard had scoliosis, and the response to that has been really intriguing in different ways. And so there's an exploration of how people have responded so far and some suggestions as to what further studies could be done to take advantage of what we now know as a consequence of the Greyfriars dig.
Is there any sense that Richard regarded himself in any way less than fully able in his life?
None of the evidence that we have would suggest that, no, because no, absolutely not. So it's a question of looking at what was the world that he was growing up in, looking at how these things are commented on in the literature that he read, that books that we know he owned, comments that were made in there, that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, I know that amongst the articles, we're about to talk to Sandra and Eleanor about theirs, but there's one which caught my eye, which is this curious article by Edward Sanders on the Stanleys of Elford in Staffordshire. A cadet branch of the Stanley family, which, of course, is prominent in the outcome of the Battle of Bosworth and of material interest, therefore, to Ricardians. This is a fascinating article. What I mean, you as the editor, what do you think it tells us? This cadet, about this junior branch of the Stanley family in Staffordshire.
Well, what I love about this article is the way telling the story of a family most people have never come across highlights really intriguing elements of what it meant to be alive in the 15th century. But it also is sort of righting a wrong of how those who have written about these particular members of the Stanley family have repeatedly misrepresented them because they've conflated them with the more famous Stanleys.
Right.
So the more famous Stanleys are, of course, Thomas Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley, who were major figures in 15th century politics. Thomas Lord Stanley was married to a sister of Warwick the Kingmaker, and then to Lady Margaret Beaufort, and so became stepfather to Henry Tudor, and is sort of notorious really for always being really cautious about how he aligned politically, was really careful not to commit. And so whilst his brother Sir William Stanley would get his hands dirty in battle earlier on, Lord Thomas always avoids this. And then when you get to Bosworth, according to the Crowland Continuator, Thomas Stanley says to Richard he's ill and he can't turn up to the battle, but he still brings an army. And Sir William Stanley, but they stay on the side and they don't ally with either side until the crucial moment when Sir William goes forward, and it looks like his contribution may well have been pretty decisive as to what happened. So they've got this reputation, and that seems to have been, well, certainly has been, used to shape and make assumptions about these other Stanleys. And so they are, as you said, they're a cadet branch. They are related, but they have their own independent interests and loyalties. So they were actually both in the service to Lord Hastings, and that actually seems to impact on where their loyalties lie, often much more than their connections, their family connections. So the interesting highlights it brings up is it opens looking at their place in local society in Lichfield, their involvement in the Guild of St Mary, and there's an indulgence that Sir John Stanley received from a certain Michael Lascaeus, because he gave a florin to Michael Lascaeus towards Michael redeeming his family out of slavery in Constantinople. And it's one of those little reminders that we're not looking at such an insular society as we often are.
Yeah.
The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was a hugely important event in European.
Seismic, surely.
Absolutely. And so, what happened was that the papacy allowed these people who were trying to bring up the ransoms for their family to grant these indulgences to people. And so it's just a little reminder of the much broader outlook that people had that's very easily forgotten.
But there's also a kind of at the heart of this sort of interesting article, which kind of goes in different directions. We then got the brutal murder of a man called William Chetwynd in 1494 by Sir Humphrey Stanley, which again is supposedly in connection with the Perkin Warbeck conspiracy, which is like, where'd you go with that?
It's a weird story because we've only got a small part of it in a way. We've got William Chetwynd's wife's plea for justice for what's happened to her husband. So we're having to read through and try and make sense of it. That apparently, so Sir Humphrey was Sir John's son, and she alleges that yes, his men had set upon him after he was lured out of his house. At some unearthly hour of the morning, apparently he was tricked into thinking that someone else had written a letter asking him to come out. I mean, why he thought it was a good idea to be going out into the middle of nowhere at such an early hour of the morning, we don't know. And then, yes, so allegedly his men then set on him and killed him. And Sir Humphrey doesn't seem to have been brought to justice for this. People are trying to understand why. So one suggestion was that Chetwynd was connected with others who were implicated in the Warbeck conspiracy, and so that this was somehow just getting him out of the way without having to go through all the trial and all the rest of it, sort of rough justice. Another suggestion is that actually it relates to a more local dispute. This is over property. And Sandra suggests that it may well be more about the local dispute, but the fact that Chetwynd was perhaps out of favour was less likely to be defended because of his other connections, may have given more confidence to Humphrey Stanley to go on with this. But what's really intriguing is that Humphrey Stanley eventually ends up being buried in Westminster Abbey. And so, whereas a number of writers had sort of assumed that his misbehaviour had led to him falling out of favour, as other Stanleys were falling out of favour, that doesn't seem to be the case. So it's just intriguing, really.
Wow. I mean, I wonder how many murderers are buried in Westminster Abbey. Best not to ask or think about that question, I suppose. All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, let's turn now to Sandra Pendlington. Hello, Sandra. Now, your essay is entitled An Interpretation of George Seeley's Letter to Sir John Weston in the Summer of 1483. And you've written, what I think people describe as a detailed assessment of a series of a query surrounding the facts and the dating of the burning of Dumfries, or alleged burning of Dumfries in 1482, which was associated with the invasion of Scotland led by Richard when he was Duke of Gloucester that year. Could you set out the findings of your article for us, please?
I think before I start, I've got to just sort of do the background to this, which is explained in the paper. In 1482, it's all about the Richard the Duke of Gloucester's year, 1482. And in that year, England and Scotland had been at war for 2 years. So we are in a situation of war between two countries who were next to each other. There are two people that Seeley mentions in his letter. One is Edward IV. The other is the traitorous younger brother of James III, King of Scots. His name was Alexander, Duke of Albany. Albany had escaped from Scotland 3 years earlier, and he was now living in Paris. In March 1482, the Scottish Parliament sent 4 ambassadors to Paris to try to persuade the King of the French to give them some armament to fight the English. 3 of those supporters were supporters of Albany, and Albany was in Paris, they were in Paris, and they almost certainly had a chat together. The very next month in April, unexpectedly, Albany arrived in England to have discussions with Edward IV, and the conclusion of those discussions was that the English army would invade Scotland to make Alexander, Duke of Albany, King of Scots, and turf James III off the throne, and that this invasion would be led by Richard, Duke of Gloucester. It took place in July and August, and this is one of the two events that Seeley talks about in his letter. The other was the large raid to Dumfries in May. The invasion was in south-east Scotland. The raid was in south-west Scotland. The raid was also led by Richard. So we're looking at the year of Richard. May, the Dumfries raid. July, August, the invasion. Seeley started the section on Scotland by describing Albany's arriving in England and then the army going on the invasion. And he deals with a few events at the beginning. And then he says that 44 settlements were burned and many lords were taken and slain. And then he just adds 3 words on the end: Dumfries is burnt. And that's all it says about Scotland in the letter. It almost doesn't seem worth researching, but it is. Because unfortunately, Seeley doesn't make clear where the settlements, burning of the settlements and the killing of the lords happened. Did they happen in the invasion or did they happen in the raid? Some historians think the invasion, some think in the raid. And so the purpose of this article is to try to discover which it was.
Excellent. So, where did you get to, Sandra? What are your conclusions and why?
Well, I'd quite like to explain how I got to my conclusions briefly, if I may.
Yeah, go
But
there.
my conclusion actually was that it happened during the invasion.
Right.
That the burnings and the slayings happened during the invasion. And the reasons were there wasn't enough time to actually burn all those settlements during the raid. It was a very swift thing. Richard was due down to deal with the invasion preparations in England. And secondly, I identified the Dumfriesshire lords and found that they were actually all alive after the raid took place. The other thing was that during the invasion, there is a list in Lord's Chronicle of settlements being burnt. And there's also a record of Scottish lords being slain, but the Scottish lords were actually slain by a group of Scots who were against James III and pro-Albany. And that's a much longer story. So we have not enough time to do the job in Dumfries, and we have records for the invasion for both things. So that led me to the conclusion that it happened during the invasion.
Okay, so how long did this raid on Dumfries and that area last for?
I think it was a day. He rode across the Solway Firth, he turned west, he burnt Dumfriesshire, and he came back again the same way. I think it was a day.
And this is at some point in July and August of that year, is it? Or
no, that was May.
That was May. So it's okay.
That was in May, yes. And then he went down to Fotheringhay, down the south of England, where the plans were made for the invasion. He then travelled north with Albany in tow in the army. We have records of him being at York, and then he went on and the invasion took place.
And why do we think he took this early trip to the west? What do we think it served?
Right. I'm with Michael Hicks on this one.
Right.
His Western March, Cumberland, Hicks describes it as being demolished during the previous winter. And it was the tradition that if the Scots raided England, they reprised that raid, and ditto the other way around. It was a reprisal for the damage that the Scots had done to Richard's patch of land across the Solway Firth during the winter. And it was quite normal. And again, as Dr. Hicks says, we shouldn't think that the people of Dumfries were victims here, because they weren't. Actually, they deserved it. They weren't killed. The beacons, the warning beacons had gone up, and they'd escaped into the hills across Devo Gillis Bridge. Nobody was killed. It was just Dumfries was burnt. They'd taken all this stuff with them. That's what they did when the English were coming.
And you've alluded to the fact that Richard, if I'm correct, he was warden of the Western Marches. So he was in charge of protecting the kind of western third of the border. Is that right?
He was up to 1480. When the war started, he was actually in charge of the whole of the north of England.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
So this is a reprisal. So it's a
Yes.
demonstration of,
Yes.
of English
They
power.
did it in 1480, and this is what started the war off. The Scots had done a raid into Northumberland, and the Earl of Northumberland, Richard, had replied with a reprisal and gone into Scotland. So we have that record. It was quite normal.
Fascinating.
That's what
Okay,
they did.
and this guy, chap George Seeley, who's written this letter, he was in where was he? He was on the continent somewhere, wasn't he?
We think Seeley is in Calais, and he wrote to Sir John Weston, who was on the island of Rhodes. And he kept, there were lots of letters between the Seeley family and Weston. They kept Weston up to date with what was going on, and they told him what they were doing on the continent if they were there. They were wool, and we think Seeley was at the Calais wool station.
Fascinating. So, what do you think in the context of the Ricardian world? What do you think this article tells us?
I think the importance is, you're asking me about the importance of the article. Well, first of all, it's a contemporary. It was written in 1482. And we don't have many contemporary records from that time. And it's important that we take a good look at these records to check them and make sure that they're accurate. But I think there's another reason as well. The raid and the invasion are both mentioned in the Seeley letter. And as far as I know, it's the only time that the two things were mentioned in the same reference. Dumfries is not mentioned, for example, in Paul's Chronicle. In March, you published a story about the invasion in the bulletin,
Which is
and
the
now
Society's magazine.
yes,
Yeah.
the Society's magazine.
Yeah.
And now we have an article about the Dumfries raid. It's no coincidence that they've been published close together, because they do go together. And I think that they tell the story of Richard's 1482. And when you actually look at what happened and the results, that story becomes very different. It changes. If you add together 44 settlements that were burnt in Dumfriesshire and the 62 during the invasion, you get 106, plus Dumfries. 106 across the area that it was. That's major scorched earth policy. Then you have the capturing and killing of lords. Historians tend to ignore that, but it's a dreadful accusation against Richard. It's totally against the military the code. You can imprison captives, you could ransom them, but you didn't kill them. The bulletin article showed that it was extremely unlikely, for political reasons, that the invasion area was not burnt. Albany was with the army. It was a land that belonged to his supporters, and some of it belonged to him as well. There was no way that land Richard was going to order that it be burned, and Albany certainly wasn't going to let him. We know that it was the Scots that slayed the lords in 1482. And all we have left is one settlement in the invasion area, and that was the Blackadder's house and tower. And they were supporters of the king, and the reference says that it was burnt by Albany and some men by the English army. Just the one. So it doesn't look as if any settlements were burnt on the orders of Richard III in 1482, just Dumfries. And no lords were slain. And that is a big change in the usual story of Richard III in 1482.
Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, that, I think, is a moment then to turn to, thank you, Sandra. We'll turn to Eleanor. Eleanor, thank you for being patient. You have co-written a fascinating article about the Lewis roll, which of course is otherwise known by an exceptional name. Yes, the Free Library of Philadelphia, MS Lewis E201, which is its proper name, but essentially it's held in Philadelphia. In Joanna's editorial, which introduces this volume of the Ricardian, she describes the Lewis roll as being, quote, what must be the most splendid of the late medieval royal genealogies created to justify Edward IV's accession. I suppose that goes quite a long way to explain why it's an important document. But, but I would be interested to know why you think the Lewis Roll is of importance.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I will agree with Joanna that I'm a historian of early modern Italy, and I get the joy of working with many different kinds of manuscripts in my work. And the Lewis Roll is certainly the most amazing manuscript I've ever encountered. So, to kind of give listeners an idea of the scope of the manuscript, it's 15 feet and 9 inches long when it's fully rolled out. So it takes up almost the entire width of the reading room at the Free Library of Philadelphia. It is also in amazing condition after it was restored recently with support from the Richard III Society. And so that allows us to fully appreciate its kind of expensive decorations. It's decorated with heraldry, gilded lettering, Yorkist roses, and these really amazing portraits of kings and dukes that intercede in the middle of the manuscript. So, why do I think that it's an important manuscript apart from its kind of splendor? Well, it's important for many reasons. One of which is related to its spectacular appearance, which is that it's clearly a bespoke production, possibly for Edward IV himself. And there are other examples like the Lewis Roll that have this kind of level of decoration. Like there's one in the Society of Antiquaries in London. And the condition of both these manuscripts indicate that they weren't, like other genealogical rolls, used very much. So they were likely given as gifts to Edward IV or to other families dedicated to his continued legitimacy on the throne. And so they give us an insight into that kind of culture of Yorkist propaganda and how these were preserved as kind of prestige items. There are many other distinctive features of the Lewis Roll. I mentioned the portraits. The other thing that was really interesting as we were looking at the Lewis Roll was the intervention of later users of the roll, which there are obviously not too many of them, but people obviously felt that they were able to modify the roll to suit their interests and needs and to correct the original scribes. And so the Lewis Roll really tells us the continued investment in these dynastic disputes well into the 18th century when somebody came in and corrected some of the quote unquote errors of the original scribe. There's also, I can go into more detail about some of the other distinctive things that are in the Lewis Roll, including its very strong interest in women and the role of females in the dynastic dispute between the Yorkists and the Lancasterians.
Before we go there, because I think we come back to, can you just sort of tell us when we think it was probably made and by whom, and if you've mentioned it perhaps being a gift to Edward IV, do we know anything about where it was or who had it?
Yeah, so it was made after 1461, but before Edward got married. That's what we know. We know that the idea that it was a gift to Edward IV comes from both the bespoke and kind of high quality of the document, and also the concluding banner of the roll, which, unlike other rolls, the Lewis Roll is extremely careful to make sure that Edward IV is the end of the roll and that people can't come in and add extended branches as they did with other rolls. It's very common. And so it ends with the prophecy of Bridget of Sweden. And we know that Edward and his family were very dedicated to St. Bridget of Sweden and Bridgentine spirituality. So Edward's family had a kind of close relationship with the order, and around the same time that the Lewis Roll was produced, Edward restored the Bridgentine House of Sion, the lands and privileges of its original foundation. So this kind of gives us some kind of hint that it was related a little bit to Edward IV and was potentially a gift for him. As for provenance, there's a lot of mystery there, and we don't talk about it too much in our edition because I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done in terms of how it made its way to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Okay, so at the moment, it's sort of unknown who created it.
There is some evidence that we hint at or suggest in our edition that there may be some connection with Wigmore Abbey, with the Abbey of the Mortimer family. We have been able to kind of pretty convincingly show that the creators of the role were referencing a manuscript of the Wigmore Chronicle, and we referenced this particular manuscript at the University of Chicago that was produced in that abbey between, I think, the 13th and the 15th century. And so it's possible that the roll was produced at Wigmore Abbey, which is in the Welsh Marches. But again, that's not conclusive. I'm not able to make any kind of conclusive statement about that. And as for its journey to the Free Library after that, we still need to do more research into that, or somebody does. Some interested party will do that.
Long story, I imagine. So it's 17 feet long. It's a hugely ornate thing. What? Just the obvious question, but what did people do with this? Did they hang it on the wall of a castle, and you walk past it, and it's a political message? What do you think? Was it just unrolled on special occasions? Do we have any idea of how these things are treated?
Yeah. So while we were working with the roll, we had a conversation about this over many months, because once you roll out something of that length, it's very difficult actually to lean over the table and read it, especially the writing is very small in some places. So this question of how the roll was used in a practical sense, or how other genealogical rolls were used, I think there's a missing piece. Maybe there was a kind of wooden technology. I think some were probably hung on walls, but the Lewis roll certainly was not, because the condition, I think, is too good. There's no kind of material evidence of it being hung up. What was very common in the use of genealogical rolls, though fortunately not the Lewis roll, was that they were unstitched. So users would take away the stitching of the parchment membranes in order to counter this issue of having to kind of side lean over the table or fold the manuscript up, or have these kind of cumbersome rolls at each end. So they would take apart the manuscript and have much more easily usable 2 to 3 feet long membranes that they were able to study. And so when we were making our edition, we did actually a similar thing. We kind of divided the roll into images that we were able to study more closely to transcribe and study the roll. But the Lewis roll, like I said, was not used very heavily, and thankfully it was not unstitched. So we still have it in its full splendor today.
Brilliant. Okay, well, there's in your article you talk about there's 2.5 feet of the roll is dedicated to this mythical woman named Albina. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Albina and why she's important.
Yes, absolutely. So most Yorkist and Lancastrian genealogical rolls open with biblical history, Noah or Adam and Eve, and then they proceed straight to the story of Brutus and the founding of Britain by Brutus. This is the story that is told in Geoffrey of Monmouth. Brutus is exiled and he arrives on the island that is called Albion, and he encounters giants, slays them, and Britain becomes Britain after Brutus. The Lewis roll begins before Brutus with, as you said, the story of Albina. And the story goes that her and her many sisters are the daughters of a Greek king, and they plot to betray their husbands. And the king discovers this plot and exiles them on a rudderless boat. And they arrive on an island and they name it after Albina. And they give it the name Albion. And then they're impregnated by demons and they give birth to the giants that Brutus goes on to slay. So this story was first popularized in the 14th century in an Anglo-Norman romance called Disgrants Gians. And it was composed as a preface to Geoffrey's account of early English settlement. And then it was translated into Latin and kind of absorbed into the sort of authoritative historiography of the 14th and 15th century, included in various other chronicles. But it's very unusual for it to appear on a genealogical roll, which is why we spent some time looking into it. So it's included in these other histories, but not really in rolls. There's only 3 other rolls that we were able to identify that mentioned Albina, and they only give it a few lines. Whereas, like you said, over nearly 3 feet actually are devoted to Albina in the Lewis roll. And so this really allows us to kind of highlight how genealogical rolls use not only text but also visual technologies in order to emphasize points that they wanted to make. So it is significant that that so much space is given over to Albina. She's also located next to Eve and the story of Eve, which is on the other side of the roll. And in between these 2 stories is a roundel portrait or scene of Adam and Eve. So that kind of portrait we've suggested stands in for both Eve and Albina. So why would the Lewis roll do this? So by asserting that Albina, not Brutus, is the beginning of English history, it's not an obvious choice, and there is some debate about why the Lewis roll might be wanting to do that. So Laura Blanchard and Susan Troxell have suggested that maybe it was an attack on Margaret of Anjou, and because the story kind of misogynistically showed how unnatural it was for a woman to attempt to govern in place of her husband, right? Which is what the sisters had tried to do in this story. We suggested that it has to do more with kind of bolstering Edward IV's right to the throne from the very beginning of the role, and establishing the role of female ancestors and kind of establishing his legitimacy. So as the Ricardian listeners will know, Edward had inherited his kingdoms through female ancestors. He claimed France through Isabel, the daughter of Philip the Fair, and the role's creators throughout the role kind of emphasized these female claims and the role of them, and to kind of counter the Salian law that was active in France, in Frankish Salian law, that did not recognize female succession. And so there's a real effort throughout the role to emphasize that Isabel, and then the Spanish Isabella, establishes his claim to the kingdom of Castile and Leon. Throughout the role is doing this, and I think Albina is doing a similar thing and trying to kind of from the outset establish that the important role of women. And they really translate a story that takes a lot of influence from other medieval and much earlier stories, including the late antique Lilith. There's a lot of parallels between this kind of themes of genealogy, sexual sin, and giant mythology with other early medieval stories like that, and then other kind of late antique stories like the one of Lilith. So yeah, it's very complicated and kind of intriguing story as to why this role decided to devote so much space to Albina, but I think it's really fascinating and speaks to the level of planning, I think, that went into the role, that they'd really made some conscious decisions to highlight the role of female ancestors throughout.
Fascinating. I think I mean, certainly it's a huge piece of it's a huge work of propagandist art, isn't it?
Mm,
And a huge learning in there,
hmm
and quantity of figures and the mixture of ancestry with fantasy. I think it's quite remarkable. Okay, now Joanna Laynesmith, in your editorial, you say that the Lewis role sheds light on the thought world of the 15th century. I love that expression, the thought world. I suppose, based on what the role tells us, how different was the thought world of the 15th century from today?
I think what's fascinating about it is how important it was to set themselves within that context of the mythology, and how they didn't seem to mind. There's almost mental gymnastics going on in order to be able to accept some of the contradictory stories that are in there. I think the value of the hereditary authority is really important there. The way it goes right back, which is of course so different from, I mean, certainly from English society now, but actually these things vary. Different parts of society have different values. So I suppose it's perhaps more different from the thought world that I perceive and those in power from then than now. But I think a lot of the ideas are actually still just as attractive elsewhere in society now, if that makes sense.
I think it does. So, Ellen, to put the same question to you, because you've spent a lot of time with this document, what do you think it tells us about the minds of men and women in the 15th century?
Yeah, so in addition to what Joanna said about the mixing of mythical and what we would consider factual history, at the same time, the role's creators are very conscious of historical debate, about debates in the sources and contradictions in the sources that they're consulting about the dates of particular kings and their reigns, and they mark this disagreement. And later contributors come in and continue that debate by crossing things out and correcting them as they saw fit. So there's that element of kind of historical sophistication, really, that is in the role, and that's really an interesting element. Secondly, I would say that the way that the role is constructed and other genealogical roles are constructed are remarkably sophisticated information technologies. They condense an enormous amount of information and are able to make, using these different kinds of visual techniques and linkages, they're able to connect different kinds of information and different aspects of history to one another, which is, I think, really reminiscent of, scrolling through a website and clicking on links and it taking you to different pages or different parts of the site. This is kind of an analogy we've been thinking about when we would put together the edition, of how people could move around the role in a way that really got to the kind of thought process of the people who are making it, which was a very sophisticated and developed way of thinking about the linkages between different histories.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. So the last question, I think, is really, how can people who are listening go and enjoy this document? Because it has been digitalized. So can listeners just go online somewhere and see it?
Yes, and please do. So we put many links and a kind of mini guide to using the edition in the article that will be in the Ricardian. But you can just Google Lewis Roll Philadelphia, and it will be the first link. And the tool is called Digital Mapper, and it is relatively simple. It takes a little experiment to kind of get around the tool, but it's relatively simple, and it will allow you to look at the images of the roll and then to interact with those images to access the translation and the transcription if you read Latin, and then to go from there to the annotations, which will tell you this was the source that the scribe either directly or indirectly used to get this information. And we also identify all of the characters on the roll. So that's a guide that you can kind of move through the roll relatively easily and know who people are and what's going on and what stage of history the roll is at. So yeah, I hope that people do use it and also give us feedback and use it in their own researches.
Fantastic. And it was a kind of multi-year project to annotate it and assess it in this fashion and digitalize all of it?
Yeah, so I worked in a team of researchers at the University of Pennsylvania. My colleague Emma Dyson transcribed and translated the roll, and other people had worked on the transcription, I think, before I even was involved in this project. So yes, it's been going on for years. Emily Steiner is the real leader of the team, and then I came on and started doing historical annotations, as I'm a historian. So I came in and my job was to kind of identify all of the sources that the roll's creators had used and to try and get as close as possible to the specific manuscript or the specific text that had been used, which was sometimes easier than other times. But yes, it was a long project, and stem back to the support that the Richard III Society had given after the conservation of the manuscript to this research.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode of the Ricardian podcast, which has been dedicated to the similar sounding Ricardian, which is the journal of the Richard III Society. Before signing off, I would like to say thank you to our wonderful guests, Joanna Laynesmith, Sandra Pendlington, and to Eleanor Webb, who was just finishing up there on the fantastic Lewis role. Thank you for joining us, guys, and for sharing your insights with us. Listeners, if this episode has whetted your appetite about having a look at the 2026 edition of the Ricardian, then I should say that this, I believe, is currently available to members. Looking at Joanna here, is it already available? Do we know?
It should be very soon. It's certainly been sent off to the website people, so hopefully by the time this actually goes out, it will be appearing in the members area of the website.
Brilliant. So you can find the journal online in the members area of the Richard III Society website. Now, if you aren't a member and would like to get the journal in, you can do so by joining the society, which you can do at the website, which is richard3rd.net, which is Richard followed by 3 I's and then .net. And that leaves me with nothing more to say thank you for listening. Thank you to my guests one more time, and bye-bye until next time.